Chapter 3: Why Most Nutrition Guidelines Are Wrong. Published and true are not synonyms. Brian A. Nosek, Jeffrey R. Spies, and Matt Motyl. Scientific Utopia. The good ship Salisbury had a grave problem on her hands. In the spring of 1747, she had left the port of Plymouth, England, with a crew 300 men strong. After just 8 short weeks at sea, at least 30 of her sailors had contracted scurvy, a disease that killed an estimated 2 million mariners between the 16th and 19th centuries. In what may have been the world's first controlled trial in clinical nutrition on record, naval surgeon Dr. James Lind took it upon himself to conduct a simple experiment. As he tells it, "I took 12 patients in the scurvy on board the Salisbury at sea. Their cases were as similar as I could have them. They all, in general, had putrid gums, the spots and lassitude, with weakness of their knees, and had one diet common to all: water gruel sweetened with sugar in the morning, fresh mutton broth, oftentimes for dinner, at other times puddings, boiled biscuit with sugar, and for supper, barley and raisins, rice and currants, sago and wine, or the like." He divided the 12 men into 6 pairs and administered the following treatments to see which, if any, might be helpful. Pair number 1, 1 quart of cider per day. Pair number 2, 25 drops of dilute sulfuric acid 3 times per day. Pair number 3, 2 spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times per day. Pair number 4, 1/2 pint of seawater per day. Pair number 5, 2 oranges and 1 lemon per day. Pair number 6, a medicinal paste of garlic, mustard seed, radish root, balsam sap, and gum myrrh. Per Dr. Lind, the consequence was that the most sudden and visible good effects were perceived from the use of oranges and lemons. One of those who had taken them, being, at the end of 6 days, fit for duty, the other was the best recovered of any in his condition, and being now deemed pretty well, was appointed nurse to the rest of the sick. Lind's results provided evidence that fresh citrus fruits could cure scurvy. Almost 400 years later, his protocol still stands as a fine example of the scientific method. Defining the scientific method can be surprisingly difficult, but its bedrock principles can be summarized in this definition of science itself, taken from the Oxford English Dictionary: the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. We would have to wait nearly 2 centuries for Hungarian scientist Dr. Albert Szent-Györgyi to identify the curative chemical stowed within those oranges and lemons as vitamin C, which earned him a Nobel Prize in 1937. This juicy revelation was just one of the many vitamin discoveries made during the so-called vitamin era of the 1930s and 1940s, all made possible by the chemical revolution, the development of laboratory techniques that allowed researchers to isolate and study vital food molecules for the first time in human history. When President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack in 1955, public fear of cardiovascular disease shifted the focus of diet research away from micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, to macronutrients, fat and cholesterol to be exact, ushering in the era of politicized nutrition in which we still find ourselves today. In an attempt to understand how complex dietary patterns cause or prevent things like heart attacks, nutrition research largely lost its way in the second half of the 20th century, veering away from solid scientific methods grounded in experimentation in favor of a wholly unscientific method grounded in guesswork called nutrition epidemiology. Most mainstream views about food and health, such as the belief that plant foods are healthier for us than animal foods, spring from nutrition epidemiology studies. So it's important to understand the serious shortcomings of this type of research and how it compares to other nutrition research methods. Modern nutrition research methods. Studying the relationship between diet and disease is no easy task, and all nutrition research methods have their shortcomings, but some methods are far more reliable than others. When you see a nutrition headline, knowing something about the kind of study that was used to generate that headline can help you quickly decide if the headline is worth your attention. Scientists sometimes disagree about which types of evidence are most reliable, but most ranking systems view case reports as the least reliable form of evidence and randomized controlled trials as the strongest, with other types of studies, including epidemiological studies, falling somewhere in between these two extremes. A nutrition case report describes how a particular dietary intervention, such as a ketogenic diet, affected the health of a single patient, while a case series describes how a dietary intervention affected the health of multiple patients who all have a similar health condition. For example, how a ketogenic diet affected 5 people who all have early Alzheimer's disease. Well-documented case reports often contribute valuable information that inspires additional research. But since they are not formal scientific experiments, these sit at the bottom of most evidence pyramids. In nutrition epidemiology, aka observational studies, researchers gather information about large numbers of people and analyze that information to look for patterns that may explain health trends in communities. An example within the world of nutrition would be conducting a survey of thousands of people about their egg yolk eating habits and their heart health history, and then sifting through their answers to see if there might be a connection between the number of egg yolks they reported eating and whether or not they develop heart disease. The lion's share of nutrition studies that make headlines are epidemiological studies, perhaps in part because they are inexpensive and relatively easy to conduct. A non-randomized controlled trial is a scientific experiment in which volunteers with similar health conditions are divided into 2 groups: an experimental group, which changes their diet, and a control group for comparison. For example, to test the effects of cholesterol-rich egg yolks on blood cholesterol levels, you might feed everyone in the experimental group 2 egg yolks per day and feed everyone in the control group something similar that you wouldn't expect to have any impact on cholesterol levels, such as 2 egg whites per day, which are cholesterol-free. At the end of the experiment, you compare the cholesterol levels of the 2 groups to see if the egg yolks seemed to make a substantial difference. These trials are called non-randomized because the decision about which volunteers join which group isn't made randomly. Instead, the researchers or the volunteers themselves decide who will belong to each group, which could influence the results. Dr. Lin's scurvy experiment would therefore be considered a non-randomized control trial, as he himself decided which sailors received which treatment. Just below the pyramid's pinnacle is the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. Widely regarded as the gold standard of scientific research methods, the randomized controlled trial, or RCT, is considered the best way to explore whether there is a cause and effect relationship between 2 items of interest, or variables, such as egg yolks and cholesterol levels. Instead of the researchers or the volunteers themselves choosing who will be on Team Yolk and who will be on Team White, volunteers are randomly assigned to each group, usually by a computer, reducing the chance that human bias will influence the results. The best designed RCTs are double-blinded, meaning that neither the volunteers nor the researchers know who is in the experimental group and who is in the control group. Pooling the results of multiple RCTs into a so-called meta-analysis is therefore considered the strongest level of scientific evidence. A well-designed RCT makes it easier to conclude that a particular dietary intervention is directly responsible for the results that the researchers observe, because it attempts to minimize other factors that could muddy the waters. For example, if one of my patients tries a ketogenic diet for early Alzheimer's disease, and she happens to score better on memory tests 6 weeks later, a scientific journal may agree to publish my findings in the form of a case report, especially if this is the first case of its kind. However, because the circumstances weren't controlled, I can't claim that the ketogenic diet was responsible for my patient's improvement. Maybe she made other changes during that same 6-week period that she didn't mention or that I chose not to include, such as eliminating junk food or taking a multivitamin. Maybe she was expecting the ketogenic diet to help because a family member had responded well to it. People who believe in a treatment are more likely to experience benefits. This is called the placebo effect. Maybe I had 10 patients with Alzheimer's who tried the diet, and she was the only one who improved, but I didn't report the other 9 cases because I wanted to share the most hopeful news. RCTs seek to minimize variables like these that can muddy the waters. For example, when researchers in New Zealand conducted an RCT comparing the ketogenic diet to a low-fat diet in people with Alzheimer's disease, they randomly divided 26 volunteers into 2 groups using randomizing software, gave them all the same dietary instructions, and told them all to take the same multivitamin supplement. They told the volunteers that both diets were potentially healthy, and volunteers weren't allowed to tell researchers which diet they were following during the study. These design elements made it more likely that the improvements the researchers documented in quality of life and ability to function were due to the ketogenic diet and not due to other variables, such as vitamin supplementation or volunteer expectations. In other words, it's more likely that the ketogenic diet itself caused those improvements to occur. Nutrition RCTs, all that glitters is not gold. Despite their coveted position within the scientific evidence hierarchy, even randomized controlled trials have their limitations, particularly when used to study food. RCTs are used all the time by pharmaceutical companies to test whether a particular drug is safe and effective compared to a placebo, but they're not used very often to study human nutrition because diet RCTs are so expensive and difficult to design. The control problem. It is impossible to study only one dietary variable at a time because you can't make one change to a diet without also changing something else. For example, if Team Yolk eats 2 egg yolks a day and Team White eats 2 egg whites a day, cholesterol content won't be the only difference between their diets. Team White will also be eating fewer calories, fewer nutrients, and less fat. These additional variables, or confounders, make it challenging to design appropriate control conditions for nutrition RCTs and to interpret their results. The blinding problem. In drug RCTs, researchers can disguise the medicines and placebos they want to test in unmarked capsules. But it is very difficult to blind volunteers in nutrition RCTs, especially if you're studying foods rather than individual nutrients or ingredients. Vitamins and food chemicals can be hidden in a capsule or stirred into a beverage, but how do you disguise a whole food like a banana? Diet study participants can usually see, smell, and taste the food being tested, which could influence how people think and behave in the study. The time and place problem. It is difficult to control and document everything volunteers eat unless you admit them to a metabolic research ward where all their meals can be prepared in a scientific kitchen and staff can record everyone's actual food intake. This is inconvenient and stressful for volunteers and expensive for researchers, making rigorous long-term diet experiments like this highly impractical. For all of these reasons, it is common for researchers to conduct nutrition RCTs in animals or in test tubes instead of in human beings. It's much easier to control animals and laboratory samples than it is to control human beings, which helps address time, place, control, and blinding problems. But when you move out of the real world and into carefully controlled laboratory settings, you introduce entirely new problems. Animal RCTs must be interpreted with caution. The most obvious problem with conducting nutrition RCTs in animals is that animals aren't humans, and different species require different diets. In 1913, Nikolai Anichkov, a young Russian pathologist interested in studying the relationship between dietary cholesterol and heart disease, wondered if dietary cholesterol could raise blood cholesterol build up in the arteries, and cause heart disease. To test this hypothesis, he fed one group of rabbits sunflower oil, the control group, fed another group of rabbits sunflower oil plus purified cholesterol, the experimental group, then measured their blood cholesterol levels and examined their arteries. From his writing, the blood of such animals exhibits an enormous increase in cholesterol content, which in some cases amounts to several times the normal quantity. It may therefore be regarded as certain that in these experimental animals, large quantities of the ingested cholesterol are absorbed, and that the accumulations of this substance in the tissues can only be interpreted as deposits of lipoids circulating in large quantities in the humors of the body. Put simply, rabbit cholesterol levels skyrocketed, often to 10 times their normal levels or higher, and fatty deposits appeared in their blood vessels within a matter of weeks. Anichkov's experiments are now considered classic because they appear to show, for the first time, a clear connection between dietary cholesterol, rising blood cholesterol levels, and cardiovascular disease. But did they? Rabbits are herbivores. They did not evolve to consume animal foods, which are the only foods that contain cholesterol. When other investigators tried to reproduce Anichkov's findings in omnivores such as rats and dogs, cholesterol levels barely budged and arteries remained clear, presumably because omnivores are equipped to safely process incoming cholesterol molecules. Careful scrutiny of rabbit arterial deposits found they bore little resemblance to human atherosclerotic plaques, and there's no mention of any rabbit having suffered a heart attack. Rabbits continuing with cholesterol treatment did perish, but not from heart disease. They ultimately developed fatty cirrhosis of the liver, hemolytic anemia, and wasted away. The cholesterol-fed rabbits exhibit anorexia, lassitude, progressive and severe weight loss, and fur thinning. The animals eventually die in a cachectic state. These century-old experiments do not demonstrate that cholesterol endangers the human heart. They demonstrate that cholesterol is poisonous to rabbits. This inconvenient truth renders them a very poor choice of subject for cholesterol research, to say the least. Nevertheless, many cholesterol scientists would come to revere Anichkov's work and revive his techniques, putting rabbits back on the methodological menu where they remain to this day. Problems with animal research go beyond species differences. While some types of animal research can generate information relevant to human health, indeed, we have laboratory animals to thank for much of what we understand about basic brain cell biology, we must interpret animal studies with caution, particularly when studying the relationship between nutrition and human disease. Laboratory animals are caged in extremely stressful artificial environments and fed ultra-processed, species-inappropriate diets. Inbreeding is commonplace, and many animals have been genetically or pharmaceutically manipulated to more easily develop diseases of interest, like diabetes or cancer. In vitro nutrition RCTs are rarely relevant. In vitro, Latin for in glass, nutrition studies examine the effects of isolated food chemicals on living cells or tissues in test tubes, petri dishes, and the like. These types of studies are frequently used to test extracts from plant foods believed to have superfood properties, such as broccoli, blueberries, and beets. Unfortunately, these experiments tell us very little about nutrition and human health, because we do not place food chemicals directly onto all of our cells in plastic containers. We swallow those chemicals in the form of food. Not only do living cells behave very differently when they are removed from the human body and grown in a laboratory, but many food chemicals don't survive digestion, aren't absorbed into the bloodstream, or are rapidly eliminated by our immune system. Just because a substance might kill cancer cells in a petri dish doesn't mean it will shrink tumors in the living human body. Nutrition epidemiology, a bridge too far. Every research method has its soft spots, but if thoughtfully designed and responsibly interpreted, All of them are capable of generating information that can improve our understanding of the relationship between food and human health. Even uncontrolled trials can be valuable. For example, if Lind had fed citrus fruits to all 30 scurvy-stricken men without any control group for comparison, and none of them had improved, that would certainly have been worth reporting. Indeed, every methodology has the potential to produce meaningful data, even most types of epidemiological studies. The notable exception being epidemiological studies of human nutrition. In this next section, I aim to convince you that any and all claims about food and human health that have been generated by nutrition epidemiology studies can and should be completely ignored. Epidemiological studies typically sit near the middle of most evidence hierarchy pyramids, but this placement overlooks the fact that not all epidemiological studies are created equal. Epidemiology can be useful when studying infectious diseases or even vitamin deficiencies, but I would argue that epidemiological studies of the relationship between dietary patterns and human health don't belong in the pyramid at all because they are wholly unscientific. The field of epidemiology, the study of epidemics, was born in the mid-1800s, with many crediting its origins to British physician John Snow. During a deadly cholera outbreak in the Soho district of London, Dr. Snow suspected that polluted city water might be to blame. To explore this hypothesis, he interviewed townspeople about their water usage habits and meticulously mapped out where infections had occurred. He noticed a striking pattern. Most infected households were clustered around a city water pump located on Broad Street. This association between proximity to the Broad Street pump and cholera infections was so strong that it convinced skeptical city officials to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. When locals could no longer draw water from that pump, the epidemic came swiftly to an end, confirming Dr. Snow's hypothesis. Epidemiology has since proved useful for understanding other diseases also caused by single quantifiable toxins, such as cigarette smoke and COVID-19. The epidemiological method of studying disease is considered observational because it relies on systematic analysis and pattern recognition instead of on clinical experiments. After all, it would be unethical to intentionally expose healthy people to potentially lethal bacteria, viruses, or tobacco. More than a century after Dr. Snow's landmark cholera study, nutrition researcher Professor Walter Willett, whom we met in the previous chapter, began applying the observational methods of epidemiology to the study of diet and chronic disease. While he was not the first to use this approach, Dr. Ansel Keys, whom we also met in the previous chapter, used epidemiology to study the relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. Willett is considered by many to be the founding father of nutrition epidemiology. He wrote an authoritative textbook on the subject, has co-authored more than 1,700 research papers on nutrition and public health, and his work continues to wield tremendous influence around the world. If epidemiology is good enough to help us understand and fight rapid-onset deadly diseases caused by infections and toxins, then why shouldn't it also be good enough to help us understand and fight slow-onset chronic diseases that may be driven by diet, such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's dementia? First of all, there's only one thing that can cause cholera, and that is cholera toxin. In sharp contrast to this clear direct relationship, as Willett himself wrote, chronic diseases almost always have multiple causes, not only diet, but also genetic, occupational, psychosocial, and infectious factors, level of physical activity, behavioral characteristics, and other influences. Secondly, Dr. Snow focused squarely on two concrete variables: where people got their water and whether they got sick. Two questions easy for any household to answer with a high degree of certainty. Diet, on the other hand, as acknowledged by Willett himself, represents an unusually complex set of exposures that are strongly intercorrelated, and patterns of consumption vary significantly over time. As we will see shortly, it is impossible to obtain concrete data about people's diets, and without data, science can't happen. This fatal flaw hasn't deterred nutrition epidemiology from taking flight. Since the 1940s, nutrition epidemiologists have been generating hypotheses about foods and human diseases, asking people about their eating habits, and looking for patterns in their answers to see if they can find associations between specific foods and specific diseases to support their hypotheses. For example, if a research group has hypothesized that the cholesterol in egg yolks causes heart disease and finds that people who report eating more egg yolks are also more likely to develop heart disease, they write a paper about the association they have observed and publish it in a scientific journal. Perhaps not surprisingly, most readers believe that academic papers like these contain scientific evidence that egg yolks endanger heart health, but this is not the case. Remember, the scientific method requires 2 steps: generating a hypothesis and then conducting an experiment. Dr. Snow used the data he gathered about water sources and cholera infections to hypothesize that water from the Broad Street pump was making people sick, but he didn't stop there. Next, he convinced local officials to do an experiment. Remove the Broad Street pump handle to see if his theory held water, so to speak. Since cholera infection rates dropped sharply, the experiment supported Snow's hypothesis. Nutrition epidemiologists do not change the diets of people, animals, or flasks of cells to see what happens. In fact, they conduct no experiments of any kind. The absence of experimentation renders nutrition epidemiology a wholly unscientific discipline. Good science is self-correcting and moves us closer to the truth. If you never put your theory to the test, you will never know how right or wrong it may be. If it is wrong, avoiding experimentation allows you to continue believing in your theory without ever having to reevaluate it. Indeed, many popular theories put forth by nutrition epidemiology fly in the face of human biology, yet are allowed to stand. Sadly, most of our nutrition beliefs have been built on these bio-illogical pillars of sand. As an example, let's take a closer look at a seemingly impressive study that is largely responsible for the belief that dutifully topping your oatmeal with blueberries every morning will help ward off dementia. This is your brain on berries. A Harvard nutrition epidemiology research group was interested in whether the antioxidants in colorful berries could help protect aging women against memory loss. Over 14 years, they studied the eating habits of more than 16,000 middle-aged women. Then, over the course of 6 additional years, they periodically tested them for signs of memory problems. Applying sophisticated statistics to their observations, they calculated that women who reported eating 2 or more servings of strawberries and blueberries per week had a slower rate of memory decline than those who reported eating fewer berries. Voila! They found an association between berries and memory protection. Because they are Harvard researchers who studied many thousands of subjects over 20 years, and their findings have the potential to improve the lives of countless women around the world, their work was published in the prestigious journal Annals of Neurology in an article titled Dietary Intake of Berries and Flavonoids in Relation to Cognitive Decline, and enjoyed widespread media attention, generating high-profile headlines like these. Eating blueberries and strawberries staves off memory decline, study suggests. CBS News. Brain food, berries can slow cognitive decline. Time Magazine. Berries keep your brain sharp. Harvard Gazette. Unfortunately, because this study is a nutrition epidemiology study, it can't tell us anything about how berries affect brain health. Why not? Memories are not measurements. Science demands data. Data, by definition, must be objective and quantifiable. In our berry study example, researchers did not record what people actually ate over 14 years. This would be virtually impossible. Instead, they administered a semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire, or FFQ, to inquire about the dietary habits of participants. You can see the entire question with all of the possible answers in the accompanying PDF, but to briefly summarize, you are provided with a list of 15 fruits and fruit products, such as 1 slice of watermelon, 1 small glass of orange juice, and 1/2 cup of berries. You are then asked how often you consumed each one. You are given 10 possible answers ranging from never or less than once per month to 6 or more servings per day. This survey asks you to recall how often you have eaten specific serving sizes of various fruits over the course of the entire previous year. If you only eat a particular fruit when it is in season, you are even asked to do the math to convert your seasonal fruit intake into an annual average. You are not given the option of responding, "I don't know," "I can't remember," or "You can't be serious." You're required to enter a specific quantity, even if you're not sure. It is wholly unrealistic to expect anyone to recall with any certainty what they've eaten over the past 12 months, when most people probably can't recall what they've eaten over the past 12 days. Scientists have long recognized that human memory is fallible. In 1984, Bernard and colleagues reviewed questionnaire-based studies across a variety of disciplines and concluded that, on average, about half of what informants report is probably incorrect in some way. Human memory is also subject to conscious and unconscious distortion. Some people may believe they eat healthier than they actually do, while others may know they eat poorly and feel shame around their food choices. These feelings may influence their answers. When 240 adults were asked how they would handle diet questions if they were to participate in a nutrition study, 29% acknowledged they would not answer questions honestly, and 46% said they did not think they'd be able to answer questions accurately. As a result, instead of neutral, objective measurements, food frequency questionnaires produce distorted, subjective estimates. To make matters worse, the researchers themselves do not appear interested in accuracy. Notice the vague and arbitrary serving sizes in their berry question. 1 slice of this, 1 small glass of that. These are meaningless, unscientific quantities. Can you imagine a laboratory chemist trying to follow an experimental protocol that calls for 1 small glass of hydrochloric acid? As Harvard chemistry professor E.B. Wilson Jr. stated in his textbook, An Introduction to Scientific Research, a measurement whose accuracy is completely unknown has no use whatever. Indeed, the very name of the questionnaire used in this study, semi-quantitative FFQ, tells us that inaccuracy is baked right into the study's methodology, as the term semi-quantitative means constituting or involving less than quantitative precision. Food frequency questionnaires are too infrequent. Using a single questionnaire to capture an entire year's worth of food choices is bound to result in grave errors. Using a single questionnaire to capture several years' worth of food choices borders on absurdity. When researchers conduct a nutrition epidemiology study that spans many years or decades, they do not administer FFQs even as often as once a year. In our berry study example, questionnaires were administered only 5 times over the course of 15 years. Researchers then simply averaged the 5 sets of answers together to arrive at total berry intake. During the ensuing 6-year period when memory tests were conducted, researchers didn't inquire about food intake at all, even if the FFQ were a reliable means of gathering data. The idea that berry intake between 1980 and 1994 would be solely responsible for any memory problems that arose between 1995 and 2001, and that eating habits between 1995 and 2001 would have no impact on memory, is challenging to accept. Imagine a physician trying to apply research findings like this in clinical practice to help patients concerned about cognitive decline. Patient: Doctor, I seem to be having more trouble remembering things lately. Doctor: Well, Barbara, research has shown that memory problems can be due to berry deficiency. How many half-cup servings of strawberries and blueberries did you eat per week 10 years ago? Modern diets are too complex for epidemiology. In the 1990s, when this berry study was initiated, a typical U.S. supermarket stocked approximately 7,000 products. Yet, the food frequency questionnaire used in this study considered only 130 food items, less than 2% of what was available to shoppers at the time. As Stanford epidemiology professor John Ioannidis noted in his 2018 article, The Challenge of Reforming Nutritional Epidemiologic Research, individuals consume thousands of chemicals in millions of possible daily combinations. For instance, there are more than 250,000 different foods and even more potentially edible items, with 300,000 edible plants alone. The fruit question reveals a failure to attempt to capture this degree of complexity, as only 15 fruits are represented. The number of blackberries, cherries, kiwis, papayas, figs, mangoes, dates, pineapples, honeydew melons, plantains, raspberries, and cranberries these women ate was apparently considered unimportant. Proponents of nutrition epidemiology willing to acknowledge its flaws rightly point out that randomized controlled trials have their limitations too, and that using RCTs to explore the long-term effects of complex dietary choices on human health is not feasible. They argue that nutrition epidemiology is uniquely capable of studying large populations over many decades and taking multiple dietary variables into consideration. Professor Willett and colleagues wrote in 2015, because of its low cost and low participant burden, self-administered computer-processed FFQs are the only option in most large cohort studies to assess usual dietary intakes. These features make possible repeated assessments over time, which is important to capture longer-term variation in diets. Nutritional epidemiology is far from being a perfect science, but with a thorough understanding of the discipline, valuable insights on diet and health outcomes can be obtained from free-living populations. In other words, we are asked to forgive the inaccuracies in their measurements and appreciate the information made possible by nutrition epidemiology studies, flawed though it may be, because it represents the best we can do. Yet data collection issues are only the tip of the iceberg. Association is not necessarily causation. Even the most thoughtfully designed epidemiology study is only capable of documenting hypothetical associations between a potential culprit and a particular disease, not of establishing cause and effect relationships between the two. Without putting your theory to the test in the real world, all you have is a hunch. Dr. Snow's cholera theory was just a theory until the water pump handle was removed. If people who report eating more berries also appear to suffer less cognitive decline than people who don't, this doesn't necessarily mean that berries have anything to do with it. The relationship between the two could be pure coincidence. If people who report eating more pretzels are also more likely to suffer from alcoholism, that doesn't necessarily mean pretzels cause alcoholism. It could simply mean that people who drink too much spend more time in bars where free pretzels are served. Yet it would be completely acceptable in the field of nutrition epidemiology to publicize that untested association using language that implies a causal relationship between the two, in a manner such as this: eating pretzels increases risk of alcoholism. I like to use this imaginary example because the idea that pretzels might cause alcoholism is so preposterous that it's easy to see the flawed leap in logic and dismiss the headline as invalid. By contrast, if an association is found between two things we've been conditioned to believe are connected, such as red meat and cancer, we are far more likely to take that claim at face value. In other words, believing is seeing. The associations observed by epidemiologists outside of the nutrition realm certainly can and have been used to help demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between two variables. Sir Austin Bradford Hill, a professor of medical statistics and epidemiology, and the first scientist to randomize a clinical trial, offered 9 viewpoints to help epidemiologists decide when an association may suggest causation, which are strength, consistency, specificity, temporality, biological gradient, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analysis. First introduced in his classic 1965 paper, Environment and Disease, Association or Causation, these so-called Bradford Hill criteria are now widely regarded as instructive considerations in the field, including by Professor Walter Willett. A discussion of all 9 criteria is beyond the scope of this audiobook, so we'll focus on the first and most important of Professor Hill's criteria, which was that associations should be strong. Epidemiologists often express the strength of their associations in terms of relative risk. Using smoking and lung cancer as an example, non-smokers are the unexposed control group, and smokers are the exposed group. Relative risk tells you how much more often lung cancer occurred in smokers compared to non-smokers. If the incidence of lung cancer is the same in both groups, then the relative risk will be 1.0, meaning there is no association. Professor Hill believed that the magnitude of relative risk should be at least 2.0 to be worthy of suspicion, meaning that smoking should be associated with at least double the risk of developing lung cancer. In fact, cigarette smoking was associated with an 8 to 32 times greater increase in risk for developing lung cancer, depending on how heavily people smoked. Drinking Broad Street pump water was associated with a 14 times greater increase in risk for cholera. These are very strong associations. By contrast, most nutrition epidemiology studies report very weak associations between specific foods and specific diseases, with relative risks falling well below the recommended cutoff value of 2.0. In a systematic review of 34 epidemiologic studies of diet and heart disease risk, relative risk topped out at only 1.38, with half of all studies coming in at 1.20 or below. Commonly, study authors will rephrase a relative risk of 1.2, which means nothing to most readers, as an increase in risk of 20%, which readers can more easily understand and makes the risk sound large and important. Professor Hill's criteria would have the scientific community dismiss these feeble associations as meaningless. Yet the results of nutrition epidemiology studies continue to be published in reputable academic journals and shared via press releases, generating media headlines that everyday people interpret as nutrition advice they can use to make healthier decisions about food for themselves and their families. The public cannot be faulted for making this leap. As Professor Ioannidis affirms, authors often use causal language when reporting the findings from epidemiological studies. Even when authors add caveats, results still are often presented by the media as causal. Nutrition epidemiologists understand that their methodology is only capable of generating hypotheses, so they choose their words carefully when describing their findings so as not to cross the line between speculation and fact. However, their nuanced rhetoric is easy for journalists to misquote and misinterpret. Even though the authors of our berry study concluded that women with higher berry intake appeared to have delayed cognitive aging by up to 2.5 years, Time magazine reported their findings confirmed that women who ate berries at least once a week were able to slow down their cognitive decline by about 1.5 to 2.5 years. Unfortunately, unlike the clear relationship between contaminated water and cholera infections, the relationship between modern diets in all their staggering complexity and chronic diseases like obesity, cancer, and heart disease do not lend themselves well to questionnaire-based epidemiological methodologies. Nutrition epidemiology in media and policy. Most journalists, clinicians, and lawmakers do not understand the serious shortcomings of nutrition epidemiology, so its unsubstantiated ideas become amplified in media headlines as implicit fact, incorporated into dietary guidelines as policy, and implanted into our collective psyche as gospel. Some of the most influential nutrition documents ever written are grounded largely in nutrition epidemiology, including the U.S. Dietary Guidelines. Issued every 5 years since 1980, this document establishes the diets implemented in all U.S. federal programs, for example, school lunches and military menus, and sets the tone for nutrition policy for much of the world. The World Health Organization 2015 report on the carcinogenicity of consumption of red and processed meat, which concluded that processed meat definitely causes colorectal cancer and that red meat probably causes colorectal cancer. And the 2019 Eat Lancet report, which recommends the near elimination of all animal foods from the human diet. We will dig into each of these later, but even if you've never heard of these publications, whenever you choose hummus over steak, oatmeal over eggs, or non-fat yogurt over cheddar cheese, you are following their recommendations. But do these dietary choices actually protect or improve your mental or physical health? Unfortunately, questions such as which foods increase our risk for cancer or which dietary patterns help us live longer lives don't lend themselves to experimentation because they seek to understand risk over very long periods of time. And this is where nutrition epidemiologists, who can repeatedly administer food frequency questionnaires to large numbers of people over many decades, find a toehold. However, rather than succumbing to the epidemiology may be flawed, but it's better than nothing philosophy, why not simply acknowledge that we don't have meaningful scientific ways of addressing these big questions? The information produced by nutrition epidemiology studies, which forms the lion's share of what we have been taught to believe about food and human health, is wholly untrustworthy. Learning how to identify and avoid nutrition epidemiology findings is therefore essential to protecting your health and the health of those you love. How to identify an epidemiological study. Whenever you feel disoriented by the fog of any given nutrition science war, whether it's about eggs, red meat, or kale, the secret to keeping your head and finding your way back to safety is learning how to identify and avoid nutrition epidemiology landmines. The next time you encounter a nutrition science headline, look for the following telltale signs. Epidemiology study titles usually include words like association, link, and risk. Epidemiology studies tend to be of long duration, years or even decades long. Epidemiology studies usually include very large numbers of subjects, thousands or even tens of thousands of people. Epidemiology studies often inspire simplistic, appalling, or appealing headlines, such as millions of cardiovascular deaths attributed to not eating enough fruits and vegetables. Your fries may be deadly. Or people who eat dark chocolate less likely to be depressed. In short, if it sounds too good or too bad to be true, it probably is. Who wouldn't want to believe that all they have to do to ward off depression is eat more chocolate? What kinds of evidence can you trust? Epidemiologists study brain food from the outside in by questioning large populations about their dietary habits and looking for patterns in their answers to guess how their food choices affect their mental health. A more logical strategy is to study brain food from the inside out by asking what the human brain needs to develop and function properly and which foods are best at meeting those needs. In our quest for foods that safely and efficiently deliver essential nutrients to the brain, we must set aside the confusing guesswork of nutrition epidemiology, which generates no real data. Nutrition randomized controlled trials do generate real data, but their quality and validity depend on how well they are designed, so their findings cannot simply be taken at face value. Clinical case reports and case series can be very illuminating, but lack patient controls for comparison limiting the conclusions we can draw from them. In short, there is no one fountain of truth we can turn to for answers. So, to gain meaningful insight into human nutrition, we need to gather information from different types of studies and use them to assemble a sturdy, three-dimensional scaffolding of knowledge that we can lean on whenever a controversial new headline comes our way. By looking beyond the realm of mainstream nutrition science, asking fresh new questions about tired topics, and seeking areas of agreement where the science is settled, we can more effectively cut through the fog of nutrition science politics and arrive at more enlightened views of brain food. Fortunately, there is also a wealth of reliable information available for us to draw upon from more rigorous scientific disciplines that are less susceptible to the whims of public nutrition debate, such as anthropology, anatomy, biochemistry, physiology, neuroscience, animal husbandry, botany, and toxicology. Scientists within these fields have been gathering fascinating facts about living things for generations that are directly relevant to our search for the truth about brain food. Human history, plant defense strategies, cell biology, brain chemistry, human digestion, and so much more. There's no way around it. If it is optimal mental health you seek, you will need to start grounding your food choices in brain biology rather than dietary ideology. And the next two chapters are here to help you do just that. Let's explore the inner workings of your brain, where the secrets to a brain-healthy diet lie waiting to be discovered.